In 1996, genetically modified or genetically engineered (GMGE) organisms were introduced into United States agriculture. Issues of ethics, efficiency, and sustainability have evolved from this GMGE introduction into U.S. agriculture. Since agriculture depends on the environment to produce food and the environment fosters a natural selection process, it may take years to affect plant and animal traits that will increase yield and quality. The biotechnology field bypassed the natural selection process by inserting genes to directly and immediately incorporate desirable traits such as resistance to plant pests and herbicides, thus inventing the GMGE organism. Furthermore, genes from unrelated, naturally incompatible species could now be cross-combined into the plant to achieve different effects or traits. Consequently, changes in plant crops affect the entire food supply and environment. Grains harvested from plant crops feed both people and animals. Many of these animals are being raised to eventually become food. Land not being used for agriculture is also affected because existing ecosystems comprised of plants and animals continue their natural selection, breeding, and cross-pollination processes alongside agricultural land. This illustrates how intricate issues of ethics, efficiency, and sustainability have developed from using GMGE organisms in agriculture. Presently, there exists an intricately large network of U.S. government agencies designed to focus and deal with specific issues. Located within this network is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The USDA oversees most aspects related to agriculture. More specifically, the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, oversees biotechnology in the form of GMGE organisms used in U.S. agriculture. Many people, whether they are consumers, farmers, environmentalists, or biotechnology innovators, rely on APHIS to be the key mechanism in balancing present and future issues of food and environment. Before introducing GMGE organisms into the environment, APHIS should require a multifaceted, collaborative, science-based study because it would better incorporate environmental resource accountability, equitable stakeholder relationships, and innovation. The first area that a multifaceted, collaborative, science-based study would positively impact is responsibility for environmental resources. Requiring this specific type of collaborative study would allow various stakeholders to successfully incorporate consideration of multiple concurrent, indirect, or delayed impacts of using GMGE organisms. The goal is to diverge from the current singularly focused perspective towards a larger encompassing approach. Research professor Charles Benbrook, who has over 20 years of experience studying agricultural biotechnology impacts, wrote an article entitled "Impacts of Genetically Engineered Crops on Pesticide Use in the U.S. the First 16 Years." The article discusses the outcome and challenges of using GMGE organisms to reduce pesticide and herbicide use. Benbrook specifically argues that there is an over-reliance in applying one single herbicide on GM or GE crops developed to resist that particular herbicide because it is causing the natural selection process to increase resistance in the weeds they were meant to manage. Further, during the time leading up to the commercialization of these organisms, the Monsanto company, who produces the herbicide being used on these crops, wrote or were co-authors on several papers arguing that the evolution of GR glyphosate-resistant weeds was unlikely, based on previous history of the absence of GR weeds. This illustrates the direct conflict caused by information supplied from only one stakeholder group. Various stakeholders have different ideas and perspectives on GMGE organisms, and so the focus of their information and answers are going to be different. While Monsanto argues against the likelihood of resistant weeds based on history, Benbrook argues the environmental conditions or natural selection process changed when using only one herbicide, and that impacts weed resistance based on current conditions. Also, biotechnology innovators such as Monsanto are now acting as entrepreneurs in the agricultural industry, and this subsequently affects the report format to become business plans rather than purely informational. More importantly, APHIS must consider all options regarding agriculture to reach its goals of increasing efficiency, production, and sustainability, which may include using biotechnology. There may be viable opportunities in using GM/GE organisms to reach these goals, and so there exists a process for introducing GM/GE organisms. University of Minnesota researchers Ellen E. McGinnis, Mary H. Meyer, and Alan G. Smith discussed litigated court cases regarding APHIS policies of field testing and deregulation of GM/GE plants in a peer-reviewed article entitled Analysis of U.S. Genetically Engineered Crop Regulation and Litigation. Specifically, GM/GE organisms undergo field testing before being deregulated. Prior to field testing, biotechnological innovators are required to put in an application to APHIS that includes background information of their GM/GE organism. This information includes the plant's taxonomy, its phenotype, the genetic material incorporated into the genome, and the method of gene introduction. They must also agree to meet performance standards to grow only in a confined field setting, including precautions to prevent persistence in the environment at the conclusion of the field test. Furthermore, APHIS allowed field testing and deregulation of two GM/GE plants that caused unaccounted effects on areas outside of the GM/GE planted areas. When organisms are novel or under determination for deregulation, APHIS must have either an environmental impact statement or assessment report made. Production of these statements and reports are imperative in preventing or mitigating environmental impacts. This process reveals an imbalance in environmental resource accountability stemming from the inability of multiple stakeholder groups to discover and delineate environmental impacts together. While it may seem in retrospect that the GM/GE plant being field tested was novel, or that the GM/GE plant being deregulated was not properly accounted for, the subsequent environmental impacts could have been prevented or lessened if multiple stakeholders had worked together. It should not be entirely APHIS's responsibility to determine all the effects or classifications of GM/GE organisms, especially when biotechnological innovators are already required to provide detailed background information of the GM/GE organism in their application. By requiring a collaborative, multifaceted, science-based study, APHIS would be presented with higher quality results and information that would make environmental assessments and decisions more effective, of higher quality, and comprehensive. Ultimately, environmental resources are better accounted for under this new requirement. A second area that can be positively impacted by requiring a multifaceted and collaborative science-based study is the advancement of equitable stakeholder relationships. The issue of using GM/GE organisms in agriculture stems from the polarization of innovation and tradition. For example, the Center for Food Safety, CFS, is an organization whose definite position is against using biotechnology or GM/GE organisms in agriculture. While the CFS's goal is to protect human health and the environment by curbing the use of harmful food production technologies and by promoting organic and other forms of sustainable agriculture, they are not fostering open communication between themselves and the biotechnology industry. The CFS article, National Weed Summit Tackles Epidemic of Herbicide-Resistant Superweeds, reports that the National Academy of Sciences met in Washington, D.C. with the potential to signal a turning point in approaches to weed management. The CFS further writes that there are two starkly different paths forward: cutting-edge agriculture grounded in a sophisticated understanding of agroecology and evolution, or another round of genetically engineered crops designed to be used with older yet more toxic herbicides. When the National Academy of Sciences entitled their official meeting the National Summit on Strategies to Manage Herbicide-Resistant Weeds, it becomes clear that the CFS is restructuring the issue of herbicide-resistant weeds to negatively portray biotechnology against traditional agricultural operations. Choosing to rename the summit and using acutely descriptive language such as starkly, cutting-edge, sophisticated, older, and more toxic not only indicates the CFS's level of opposition against GMGE organisms, but ultimately closes communication opportunities. These communication opportunities are imperative in addressing CFS's issues with using GMGE organisms in agriculture and building relationships between more stakeholder groups. Concurrently, there may be a lack of cooperation in information sharing that is interfering with transparency and building equitable stakeholder relationships. Cooperation and transparency are of extreme importance when fostering strong, equitable relationships between people and organizations. Brendan Burrell, who holds a PhD in biology from the University of California, Berkeley, and has received multiple journalism awards for his writing, questions Roger Beachy, pioneer of biotechnological research in agriculture, in his Scientific American article, Food Fight. Roger Beachy is quoted to have said the research field would be more advanced if more academic scientists were involved in testing and other types of experimentation, and sees that GM/GE seed isn't made readily available for academic scientists' use because of previous incomplete or poorly designed studies. Because biotechnology is relatively new and largely sophisticated, there is a disparity between comprehension and application in constructive studies, thus blocking, reducing, or interfering with answers that other stakeholders like the CFS desire. The biotechnology field wants the ability for their seed to be properly demonstrated and researched, but do not want the GM/GE seed weaknesses to be overly dramatized and misused as can happen with some anti-biotechnology supporters. Opportunities to open communication and solutions between stakeholders can be fostered by requiring them to work together on a multifaceted, collaborative science-based study regarding GMGE organisms. That in turn would bring equality to their relationships without total submission or deletion of their goals. Innovation is a third area that would be positively impacted from requiring a multifaceted, collaborative science-based study. The world population and environment are continually going to challenge agriculture in producing food, and so the future of agriculture and environment will ultimately rely on innovation to meet these demands. According to a research team's article entitled "Solutions for a Cultivated Planet," there has been an increase in agricultural intensification that is responsible for most of the yield increases of the past few decades. This intensification has caused water degradation, increased energy use, and widespread pollution. There has been and will continue to be environmental degradations or changes from using various agricultural techniques to produce food. The eventual pressure of demands and risks to environmental resources are going to pressure stakeholders to come together and create ideas to deal with these challenges. Some GMGE organisms are currently being used to deal with insect and weed challenges in food crops, but there may be other ways that biotechnology can be used. Toby A. Bruce, who holds a PhD in science and is a current researcher, wrote an article entitled "GM as a Route for Delivery of Sustainable Crop Protection." Bruce argues that genetically modifying plants to increase phosphate mobilization and nitrogen use efficiency would reduce crop requirements for fertilizer and reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture. Phosphate and nitrogen are soil components that plants need in order to be productive, and so to increase these two nutrients would increase the plant crop. Bruce has created or innovated a new way to incorporate biotechnology into agriculture that could potentially benefit consumers, farmers, environmentalists, and biotechnology innovators. Bringing more people together and creating a dialogue between them about any or all ideas to create sustainable agriculture is a reason to require a multifaceted, collaborative science-based study. Where one idea may not work, there is a potential to build on or from a part of it. After considering a lot of people, perspectives, ideas, and risks, APHIS becomes the most important agent to agriculture and environment. While some stakeholder groups do not agree with using GMGE organisms in agriculture, there is a need to keep all options open because of increasing food demands and environmental changes. GMGE organisms can potentially impact the environment, but so do other types of agricultural techniques. The ongoing polarization of innovation and tradition can be diminished by requiring a multifaceted, collaborative, science-based study. Various people and organizations can be brought together to discover, delineate, prevent, or mitigate effects from using GMGE organisms, and this would increase environmental resource accountability. Most importantly, equitable stakeholder relationships can be fostered, and this would incorporate innovation. The common ground for all groups is to find ways to support efficient food production and protect environmental resources. All these effects from requiring a multifaceted, collaborative, science-based study would positively impact APHIS and their role as agent to agriculture, environment, and the people.